It was the most crowded place that has ever existed on the surface of the earth. 33,000 people packed into a single block of buildings the size of a few football fields, with no government, almost no laws, and at street level, no daylight at all. By every rule of how a city is supposed to work, it should have been hell. And yet inside, people ran shops and schools and clinics, raised families, and built one of the tightest communities Hong Kong has ever known. This is Kowloon Walled City, how a legal accident created a lawless city within a city, how 30,000 people actually lived, stacked on top of each other in the dark, and why it was wiped off the map. Kowloon Walled City began as a mistake in a treaty. In 1898, when Britain leased the territories around Hong Kong from China, one tiny patch was written out of the deal. A small Chinese fort of a couple of hectares was to stay under Chinese control. Almost immediately, the arrangement broke down, and that left the little walled fort in a strange legal limbo. Britain claimed it but chose not to govern it. China owned it but did not administer it. For decades, it sat as a quiet, half-forgotten enclave. Then came war. A civil war and then the Second World War tore through China. Refugees poured into Hong Kong, and many of them found the one place where no authority would move them on, the ungoverned patch of Kowloon. A few hundred residents became a few thousand. And with no one in charge, they simply started to build. What happened next was unlike anywhere else on Earth. With no planning office, no building codes, and no inspectors, the residents built upward and inward until the whole enclave fused into a single structure. Around 350 separate buildings, most of them 10 to 14 stories high, grew together until you could cross much of the city without ever touching the ground, through connected rooftops, ladders, and interior stairwells. It became one continuous man-made cliff. There was only one thing stopping it from rising higher: airplanes. The city sat directly under the flight path of Kai Tak, Hong Kong's old airport, and jets came down so low over the rooftops that the buildings had to be capped at around 13 or 14 stories, while residents on the roof could look up and practically see the rivets on the planes screaming past overhead. From the outside, it was a monolith. From the inside, it was a labyrinth. At ground level, the alleys were so narrow and so completely roofed over by the buildings above that almost no sunlight ever reached the bottom. Residents walked to and from their homes through a permanent, dripping twilight, past a chaos of exposed water pipes and thick tangles of stolen electrical cable. Outsiders got lost within minutes. The postmen assigned to the city had to memorize the maze by hand, and the people just kept coming. At its peak in the late 1980s, an estimated 33,000 people were living inside those 2.5 hectares. That works out to a density of well over 1 million people per square kilometer, the most densely populated place ever recorded on the planet by a huge margin. Because it was ungoverned, the walled city earned a fearsome reputation, and part of it was earned honestly. For years, it was run in the shadows by triad gangs, and it filled with the businesses that thrive where the police won't go: gambling dens, opium parlors, and brothels. But that is only half the story, and the smaller half. Behind the vice was an entire ordinary economy that the rest of Hong Kong quietly depended on. Because no one inside needed a government license, dozens of unlicensed dentists and doctors set up cheap clinics, many of them properly trained on the mainland, and drew paying patients from all over the city who couldn't afford the legal prices outside. Food factories inside the city turned out fish balls and noodles that supplied restaurants across Hong Kong. There were unlicensed schools, temples, and shops of every kind, and residents organized themselves, forming their own mutual aid associations to handle disputes, charity, and daily order that no official ever provided. Up on the rooftops, above the airless dark, children did their homework and neighbors came up for the only open sky the city had. Out of total anarchy, a working community had quietly assembled itself. By the 1980s, the walled city had become an impossible problem. It was a public health and fire nightmare that no government would claim, and Britain and China were finally negotiating the future of Hong Kong itself. In 1987, the two governments jointly announced that the walled city would be demolished. It took years to relocate its 30,000 residents, with a compensation package that eventually ran to billions of Hong Kong dollars. Before the wrecking crews arrived, a small group of photographers and researchers went inside to record it, producing the only detailed portrait we have of the city in its final days. Demolition began in March 1993 and finished in April 1994. The single most crowded place in human history was reduced to rubble, and then to a quiet public park, where a few preserved stones of the original fort are almost the only proof it was ever there. Kowloon Walled City should, by every expert prediction, have been a place of pure misery, and parts of it were. But the reason it still haunts architects, filmmakers, and city planners is the other part, that 30,000 human beings, given no rules and no help at all, did not simply descend into chaos. They built plumbing and power, clinics and schools, trades and traditions, and a fierce sense of community, a whole functioning world in the dark from nothing. It has since inspired a generation of cyberpunk films and games, all trying to recapture that impossible image. A single building that was also an entire city. But the real lesson is quieter and more human than any of them. The most crowded, most lawless place that ever existed turned out, up close, to be mostly full of ordinary people, simply making a life. If there's another forgotten place or disaster you think the world needs to know about, tell us in the comments, and we'll bring it back into the light on this channel.